Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have Abby Fraser here to talk about rainfall variability and drought in the Hawaiian Islands. Dr. Abby Fraser is currently a postdoctoral research geographer with the USDA Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station and the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry in Honolulu, Hawaii, leading a new effort to understand the future of drought impacts in Hawaii. Dr. Fraser received her PhD and master's degrees in geography from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, studying rainfall variability in the Hawaiian Islands, and has a BS in mathematics and a BA in geography from the University of Vermont. Her research interests include climatology, geospatial analysis, geostatistics, climate variability, big data analysis, and landscape ecology. Thank you, and take it away, Abby.
All right, thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you all for tuning in this morning. I'm really excited to be here. And before I jump into the content, I want to make sure to thank all of the folks who've made it possible for me to be here. In particular, Dave Helweg and the Pacific Islands Climate Science Center for funding my postdoc and parts of my PhD. Christian Giardina at the USDA Forest Service, USDA Climate Hubs, and Tom Jambaluka at the University of Hawaii at Manoa Department of Geography. So today I'm going to cover a bit of background on climate in Hawaii and rainfall in particular, and go over the motivations and objectives for this project. And the rest of the talk will focus on two main topics, how different types of drought are expressed in Hawaii, and the results of a new gridded drought analysis that we have been working on. So let me take you all to Hawaii at this time. So we are located in the Central Pacific and are made up of 8 major islands. Oahu is our most populous island, with Honolulu labeled here. In the southeast corner, you see Hawai'i Island, or the Big Island, where we have Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and the famous Kona Coast, which you may be familiar with if you are a coffee drinker. And our islands have extremely complex topography. If we look at the peak elevation for each island, you can see that we go from sea level up to over 4,000 meters, or almost 14,000 feet. And this complex topography, as you can imagine, leads to quite varied climate patterns. So Hawaii is home to incredibly diverse climate patterns over a small area. We have moderate temperature and humidity, persistent trade winds coming from the northeast. Thunderstorms are fairly rare, and we have extremely dry, high elevation areas above 7,200 feet. And so these diverse climates lead to a wide range of biomes. We have tropical rainforests all the way to barren alpine zones. And none of these climate variables exemplifies our diverse patterns more than rainfall. And this is a map showing mean annual rainfall for the state of Hawaii. And when we put in our prevailing winds, our trade winds coming from the northeast, these interact with our mountain slopes, producing wet windward areas and dry leeward areas. And most places in the state have a wet season from November to April and a dry season from May to October. If we look at the range in rainfall values here, we have a greater range in rainfall in the state of Hawaii than you find on some continents. We have places in the rain shadow areas that get less than 10 inches of rain per year. In Honolulu, we receive about 25 inches of rain a year. And in the mountain summits, we get places on Oahu that receive 250 inches of rain a year. North of Hilo on Hawai'i Islands, about 300 inches of rain a year. And in the center of Kauai, we get almost 400 inches of rain a year. But our wettest place in the state is actually on East Maui, a site called Big Bog. And this area receives 400 inches of rain per year on average, making it not only the wettest place in Hawaii, but the wettest place in the United States. So when people think of Hawaii, there's often this perception of lush, beautiful rainforests and, wettest place in the United States. So how important is drought in a place like Hawaii? Well, in 2010, we had our driest year on record, at least back to 1920, followed by 2012, which was our second driest year. And according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, over 50% of our land area experienced moderate to extreme drought conditions from mid-2008 to January 2014. So this was an extremely long, dry period. And it had impacts across the state in many different types of sectors. And I think this particular drought event, because of its multi-year duration, opened a lot of people's eyes in the state to the fact that Hawaii is actually fairly vulnerable to drought. So a lot of questions arose after this 2010 drought period. Is this 2010 drought a normal drought? How does it compare to previous drought events? Are droughts getting worse? Is this drought an example of how droughts will be in the future? How will drought conditions change in the future? What can we expect? And we realized the last real comprehensive drought analysis for Hawaii was done in 1991. And we now have a lot more data sets available to us, in particular gridded climate data. So a new drought analysis was needed to understand what the impacts have been in the past, to establish that baseline to prepare for future droughts. So the objectives of the project for my postdoc are first to complete a literature review from all previous drought studies that have been done to update that 1991 report. Secondly, to do a new retrospective analysis of meteorological drought conditions using a new drought index product, which I will get into. Third objective is to use downscaled climate projections to determine the future of drought probabilities in the state. So Hawaii has a very small spatial extent, and we rely heavily on the use of downscaling from the global climate models because our whole state tends to fit in just a couple of grid cells in the global climate models. So they're too coarse to understand what's going on in the state. And lastly, we want to better understand resource managers' decision-making processes during drought and responses to drought. So we're hoping with this project to conduct a survey of land managers in the state so that we can understand what types of data that they're using and how we can provide better data products for them. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on the first two objectives here. And to go through the previous literature, I'm going to talk about how drought is expressed using the 5 different types of droughts that are typically recognized. And most of you have probably seen this, but we categorize drought often into meteorological drought, which is when you first get that precipitation deficiency and you get this low infiltration and reduced runoff. And this is often accompanied by low relative humidity, high temperatures, and increased evapotranspiration. As that meteorological drought persists, you get soil water deficiency, and this tends to lead to plant water stress and reduced biomass and yields. And again, as time progresses and that meteorological drought persists, this eventually impacts our hydrology. So we get reduced stream flow and potentially reduced groundwater recharge. And this has impacts on our economic and social impacts and impacts in our ecosystems. So I'm going to focus on the physical types of drought today. So Hawaii has a very extensive network of rain gauges in the state. We're extremely fortunate to have this great data set. As of about 2010, we had around 430 gauges operating in the state. And you can see their spatial spread here on the map. But this number has changed over time. It actually peaked in the late 1960s when we had over 950 rain gauges operating at the same time in the state, which is an incredible number of gauges. And this is mostly due to the plantation agriculture. As the plantations, the sugarcane and pineapple expanded, they installed more rain gauges. And as they began to close down, they discontinued many of those gauges. So this expansive network of data allows us to monitor the meteorological conditions in the state. And we can't talk about drought and rainfall without considering natural variability. So our climate in Hawaii is strongly influenced by large-scale modes of natural climate variability, such as the El Niño-Southern Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and the Pacific North American. And ENSO in particular, due to its, our location in the tropics and the fact that the phases recur pretty frequently, every 3 to 7 years, has very strong seasonal impacts on our rainfall. So if we look at the seasonal rainfall anomalies for the state of Hawaii during strong El Niño events on the left and strong La Niña events on the right, we can see that in winter months, December, January, February, El Niño events tend to give us anywhere from 10 to 80% below normal rainfall, while La Niña events give us 10 to 50% above normal rainfall. And you see that the pattern is opposite in the summer and fall months. So with a strong El Niño, in the summer and fall, we typically have increased tropical cyclone activity near the Hawaiian Islands. So this brings us wetter summer and fall conditions as we head into a dry winter. And for La Niña, it's the opposite. We tend to get a dry summer followed by a wet winter. And so in Hawaii, most places have their wet season in the winter. And so drought events are typically associated with El Niño events. So we expect when we're getting an El Niño event that we're going to have a very dry winter. But we also have to consider all of this variability within the context of baseline change. And in Hawaii, there's evidence for rainfall trends decreasing. So this is a 500-year reconstruction of winter rainfall over the past, for the past 500 years. And we see a drying trend in the last about 160 years. And when we look at the spatial patterns of that drying, the spatial patterns are heterogeneous. So we see this is looking at a rainfall trend map for the dry season from 1920 to 2012. And the red colors are showing you decreasing trends, the blues are increasing trends, and anything in the black hatching is statistically significant. And we can see, especially on the leeward side of the Big Island, very strong decreasing trends in the dry season. But the patterns, like I said, are not homogeneous. For future rainfall, the projections right now are showing that leeward areas are expected to get much drier. And you can see this here in the statistical downscaling annual rainfall projections. The windward areas are expected to remain the same or see slightly wetter conditions. So there's a little bit of discrepancy between the different methods. But in general, we have a consensus that leeward areas are expected to get much drier. And these are already highly drought-prone regions. Another trend we've been seeing is in consecutive dry days, which is sort of a metric for drought. And a study from 2010 showed that most stations around the state have experienced upward trends in their annual maximum CDD, or consecutive dry days, over this period. And a more recent study has shown that the leeward areas in the state show the largest increases in consecutive dry days. So we're seeing drier trends across the state, but in particular, leeward areas are highly vulnerable. Now, in terms of agricultural impacts of drought in Hawaii, farmers and cattle ranchers are some of the communities most immediately affected by drought. State and county governments pose voluntary and mandatory water restrictions, and typically for irrigation, they are mandatory water restrictions. And non-irrigated areas tend to receive lower crop yields, reduced ground cover and pasture, and farmers often have to import water. They see crop losses and lose significant revenue and often take out loans. And there was a study in 2010 that interviewed folks in the agricultural sector and found that many farmers find that it's difficult to make decisions based on experience when current conditions no longer seem to reflect the past. And so it's been becoming increasingly difficult for farmers in the state when we have these drier conditions. And cattle ranchers often see increased cattle mortality and reduced calving rates. They have to reduce herds, lease pasture lands, and they experience economic losses for several years following drought. In 1999, in the cattle industry alone, the revenue losses were around $6.4 million, and the following year, another $9 million in revenue losses. So drought has a major impact for the farming and ranching communities here in Hawaii. Now, it also has large impacts on our water supply. So 99% of our drinking water comes from groundwater in the state of Hawaii. And the most important aquifers consist of a freshwater lens that floats on more dense seawater. And for a thin aquifer, like in the Kona region, these tend to be more vulnerable to drought and to periods of low rainfall because the transition between the freshwater and the saltwater is shorter, and you have higher likelihood for saltwater intrusion. And in the thicker aquifers, like the Pearl Harbor aquifer on Oahu, these are less sensitive to periods of low rainfall. However, when you have increased water demand due to drought, you end up with higher pumpage, and the water levels in these thick aquifers can decline. We've also seen in the stream base flow across the state long-term declines over the past century or so, and these are likely related to a decrease in groundwater storage and recharge. So there is, this serves as an indicator of decreasing water availability across the state, so likely related to the decreasing rainfall trends. And ecological impacts in Hawaii, we actually don't have a lot of documented impacts in the literature. A lot of the examples that I'm about to show are individual examples that we've heard from resource managers across the state, but there's not a lot that's actually published in peer-reviewed articles here. But we have evidence for ungulate problems being exacerbated during drought. The feral ungulates change their foraging patterns and encroach onto pasture lands and into populated areas. We also see pest problems exacerbated, and this in some cases can lead to forest loss and mortality of native trees. But we don't know the extent of how much drought-induced tree mortality we can expect with future drought. We need more studies on that. Drought also threatens rare and endangered species. It leads to invasion by weeds and other non-native species, and the decreased topsoil often leads to increased erosion and sediment delivery to the nearshore areas. So this is also impacting our coral reefs in the nearshore areas. And we see increases in wildfire. And this is probably the most dominant effect of ecological impact of drought in Hawaii. And wildfire is a major threat to natural resources and native species in the state. Over the past century, we've seen an increasing trend in annual area burned. And the largest areas burned are often in dry, non-native grasslands and shrublands. And when we compare the percent area burned in Hawaii to the U.S. mainland and just the western states in the mainland, over this period of 2005 to 2011, Hawaii actually had a greater percent area burned than the mainland. So wildfire is a major threat here in Hawaii. And wildfire is linked to El Niño events. So that wetter summer and fall that I mentioned previously increases fuel loads, especially in dry areas across the state. And then you head into the dry winter, which increases the potential for wildfire occurrence and spread. So when we know that we're supposed to experience an El Niño event, the folks, especially at Pacific Fire Exchange, do a great job of doing lots of outreach and education to alert folks to this pattern and try to reduce human ignitions. There's also some evidence from remote sensing studies about how vegetation in Hawaii responds to drought. There was a statewide study looking at wet and dry forests during an El Niño-induced drought, and they found that the dry forests browned down during the drought, while the wet forests greened up. And their theory for why this was happening was because these wet forests are typically light limited. They're cloud forest areas that when we get a drought and the clouds are no longer there, they can actually photosynthesize more. So we see this greening signal in the wet forest. And another recent study that looked at an area on windward Maui looked at 4 different drought events and compared 2 different remote sensing products in a wet forest and a shrubland, and found that the first 3 droughts that they looked at showed an overall greening signal consistent with the statewide study that during drought the wet forests are light limited and they green up. But during this last drought period, the 2008 to 2014 period, both the wet forest and the shrublands showed browning. And so likely the long duration, that multi-year nature of that drought, overrode the light limitation, and water became the limiting factor. We also have new evidence showing that on Hawai'i Island, long-term drying trends, so that long-term baseline change, these trends are driving a large-scale decline in forest canopy volume and greenness. So this long-term drying is affecting our forest structure and functioning. And we can see the red here in the leeward part of the Big Island, looking at mean photosynthetic activity. So there's evidence not only that short-term drought events are causing browning and stress in our ecosystems, but also that this long-term drying is having impacts. So for the rest of the talk, I want to focus on this new retrospective analysis that we've been working on. So to analyze drought in Hawaii, we need to find a good source of data. And the U.S. Drought Monitor is the most widely used product for current and past drought conditions in the state. It's updated every week. It's posted online. It has these really well-defined drought categories that are easy to interpret. But the spatial detail isn't great. It's fairly smooth. And the product only goes back to 2000. So if you're trying to analyze drought prior to the year 2000, this product isn't going to work very well. We also have KBDI that's calculated here in Hawaii, and this is a really useful metric for fire managers. But right now it's only calculated at one station at the Honolulu airport, and this is not very representative of statewide drought and fire conditions. And in terms of data that you would need to calculate PDSI or SPEI, these more complex metrics of drought, we don't have enough data on soil moisture or evapotranspiration in the state to be able to calculate these. What we do have is a lot of great rainfall data, however. So we can use an index like the SPI, the Standardized Precipitation Index. This is one of the most commonly used indices around the world for looking at drought. And it's great because it allows you to look at drought over multiple time periods. So you can look at a 1-month, a 3-month, a 6-month SPI. So for example, a 3-month SPI in August of 1990 would look at the June, July, August 1990 rainfall and compare it to all June, July, August rainfall in every year. So your sample needs to have at least 30 years. And it's standardized and normalized, so you can look at wet and dry periods. And the units are just number of standard deviations, or z-scores. So any positive values are wetter than the mean, and the negative values are drier than the mean. So you can pick out drought events when it dips below 0 for a long enough period of time. And it has very nicely defined definitions of what constitutes a mild drought, a moderate drought, a severe drought, or an extreme drought. So this is a very appealing index. And so what we've done in Hawaii is using monthly rainfall maps from 1920 to 2012. Matt Lucas, who's a student at the University of Hawaii here, calculated the SPI at every 250 meter pixel in the state, and then mapped the SPI values. He did this for 10 SPI time periods from 1 month up to 16 months. And this now allows us to calculate the frequency, variability, and trends in drought back to 1920 and to identify drought events through space and time. And when we look at how this 250-meter spatial resolution compares to the drought monitor, we get much better spatial detail. So this is a look at the 6-month SPI maps for the Big Island from January 2008 to December 2012. And remember, this was that extremely dry period that I mentioned earlier. And you can see where the drought grows and which areas it starts in. So around the summer of 2008 is when we start to see some strong drying going on, and then it spreads and the entire island is experiencing drought. And then we get some relief in 2009, but the El Niño event we get in 2009-2010 leads to some pretty strong drying, especially on the leeward side. And by 2010, you can see we have extremely dry conditions across the Big Island. And again, it subsides a little in 2011, and again in 2012, we get hit with more very, very dry conditions. So some of the preliminary results that we've calculated are mean SPI by decade. And this allows us to identify wet and dry decades and periods overall, and the spatial patterns there. And one thing we've picked out from this is that the last decade has been the driest on record, with statewide drought conditions present 90% of the time between 2006 and 2012. When we look at proportion of time in drought, or sort of a frequency metric, from 0% of the time in drought to 100% of the time in drought, we see that the last decade, again, you have places that are in drought about 80% of the time during this decade. So we can look at metrics like that. We can also look at the number of severe and extreme drought months by decade. So the number of months where your SPI was less than -1.5. And we can see pretty low drought statistics for the first half of the century, and then starting in the 1970s, we see a real ramping up of number of dry months that we have statewide. And if you pay attention to this last decade column, 2010 here only contains 3 years of data and has a higher number of severe and extreme drought months than we've seen in the entire rest of the record. And we can look at that same statistic by island to get a feel for some of the spatial patterns. And we can see that the 2010 decade isn't the driest necessarily for everyone, but the Big Island was especially hit hardest by that the dry years in 2008 to 2012. So we can see the spatial patterns here a little bit. And what we're working on right now is identifying events, so all historical events, and getting a sense for the spatial extent of each event, the duration, the frequency, and severity, and hopefully getting maps like this and better, seeing where the drought started and how it grew. And this is going to allow us to answer questions such as what was our most severe event, what was our longest event, are there differences or trends by island or through time, what is the role of El Niño and La Niña, how are the droughts related to El Niño, and where are the most drought-prone areas, where are the highest drought frequencies. So we'll be able to answer all of these questions once we can pull out all of these events and be able to place that 2010 drought into context. We also, with this geospatial product, can provide customized drought data for different conservation lands in the state. So we're planning to extract the drought data for national parks, for natural area reserves, for private lands, DOD lands, pretty much anyone who has a land area that they want to look at. We can extract the SPI data and provide a customized drought history for that area to help with management efforts. So I'll go through an example where we've actually done this so far. And this example is based on windward Maui, and we call the study area the forest line. It's the upper limit of the cloud forest where it transitions into subalpine shrublands. And again, it's on windward Maui, and it corresponds with the upper limit of the bird habitat. And why this study area is particularly interesting is because we have not only contemporary evidence, but also paleoecological evidence that El Nino-induced drought events drive forest line position. So we extracted the SPI data for the forest line on Maui, and we identified 28 drought events from 1920 up to present. And for each event, we calculated the intensity, the magnitude, and duration. And the magnitude is plotted here for the 28 events that we've found. And the last drought, this 2008 to 2014 drought, had the longest duration. So average duration is about 15 months. This drought had a duration of 70 months. It has the highest magnitude and highest peak intensity of any other drought in the record. And when we lined up these 28 droughts from the forest line with ENSO events, so strong, moderate, and weak El Nino events and strong, moderate, and weak La Nina events, we tried sorting based on the different metrics to try to understand the relationship. In general, we found that of these 28 droughts, about 2/3 of them were associated with El Nino events, but about half were associated with La Nina events, which I don't think we were quite expecting. And when we sort the 28 droughts based on their intensity, we see that some of the most intense droughts were associated with weak El Nino events, while some of the least intense droughts were associated with strong El Nino events. So there wasn't really a clear pattern based on drought intensity. When we sort based on drought duration, again, we see some of the shortest duration droughts are associated with strong El Nino events, and one of the longest droughts was associated with a moderate La Nina. So this kind of goes against our idea that a strong El Nino event always leads to a strong drought. But one thing we did notice was that the two longest droughts in the record, that 2008 to 2014 and a 1971 drought, were associated with 3 ENSO events, back to back to back. Some kind of La Nina, followed by an El Nino event, followed by a strong La Nina. And when we looked into the actual rainfall during those events, we found something interesting. So this map is showing the average rainfall anomaly for all strong La Nina events in our record. So this, on average, is what strong La Nina events do to our rainfall. And you can see our forest line study area here. Typically, we get wetter than average winter conditions during La Nina. And if we look at the 2 strong La Nina events associated with those 2 longest drought events, we can see that in the forest line area on Maui, that these 2 events did not lead to the typical rainfall response. That during these strong La Ninas, we didn't get the wetter than average conditions that we were expecting. And so this leads us to the conclusion that we need to better understand the stability of the ENSO rainfall relationship. How has this been changing? And there has been a recent paper showing that since the 1950s, rainfall during La Nina events has been decreasing. And the other thing that this tells us is that the sequence of ENSO events matters. So if you get an El Nino event, so you have a dry winter, you then follow that with a La Nina, so you get a dry summer. And then instead of getting a wet winter, you get another dry winter with this type of La Nina that we saw, then you're going to have dry followed by dry followed by dry. So the sequence of these ENSO events could be driving these long duration droughts. So with that, I'll wrap up. And hopefully I've convinced you that drought is a prominent feature of Hawaii's climate with severe impacts in multiple sectors, and that we've been seeing long-term drying in the state that's expected to continue in these leeward drought-prone areas. And this new analysis that we're working on will update this 1991 report and identify data gaps. We're hoping to provide high-resolution drought information, identify the spatial details of ENSO's influence on drought, improve our understanding of ecological drought, look at drought changes in the future, and conduct a manager survey so we can provide more relevant data products. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Abby. I see a few people. Oh, Richard, all right. I see you right there. Richard, if you're on the phone, go ahead and press *6 and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great talk, Abby. I did have a question about why you chose the specific SPI time scale that you did. Why did you choose the 6-month instead of another time scale, say the 3-month or the 9-month?
So this was just an example of one that we've picked out. We're planning to do the multiple different time scales and see what best correlates with what's happening on the ground. But, you know, 6 months gives us an idea of sort of the seasonal changes that are going on and starts to give us an indication of when we're going to see hydrological impacts. So we're planning to pull these out for different SPI time periods as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, it looks like Paul put in a question. It appears that trade winds are a key factor in rainfall patterns. Has there been analysis of trade wind patterns and how they are affected by climatic drivers?
There have, actually. Thanks, Paul. There was a recent study that showed that our trade winds have actually been shifting in direction. So instead of being predominantly northeast, they're shifting to a bit more east-northeast. And so this is part of a regular cyclical pattern. Every 20 years or so, our trade winds tend to do this sort of shift. But this, I don't think anyone's taken it the next step further to really analyze how these shifts in the trade winds are actually possibly driving some of these changes in rainfall, or how that's related to ENSO. So there have been some studies of the data on the ground, but I don't think anyone's taken it to the next step yet.
Okay, and we have a question from Jonathan. The Hawaii City Council tomorrow is considering a water use and development plan update for the Kiwahu Aquifer. I hope I said that right. I probably didn't. It is the main planning document for water use for the state and county in the area. The report does not issue or use the word drought, not talk about the concept. Do you have any reaction?
Wow, that's a little bit surprising, especially considering that West Hawaii was one of the hardest hit areas in this last drought, or in the 2010 drought that we had. And again in 2015, 2016, we had another drought, and again, West Hawaii was hit pretty hard by this. So I find it surprising. Hopefully they're at least, if not considering drought events, hopefully considering the long-term drying that has been shown in that area, because I think, maybe more so than drought, this long-term drying would have big impacts on that aquifer.
Okay, and I see a few people are typing away. And we have a question from Namaka. Are you considering the impacts of the current eruption of Kilauea and the associated VOG on drought conditions in West Hawaii?
Hi, Namaka. Thank you so much for that question. That's actually one of our leading hypotheses for why we've seen such strong declines in rainfall in West Hawaii is due to the eruption of the Kilauea volcano. So it's been erupting pretty consistently since 1983, and a lot of that fog, or volcanic smog, gets carried over to the leeward side of the island. And what it does is it acts as a cloud condensation nuclei and spreads the cloud droplets out too thin, and so they're not heavy enough to actually fall as rain. And so this is one of our leading reasons for why the rainfall has been declining so steadily in this region. Yeah.
Okay, we got tons of questions today. This is great. Has there been an analysis of the quality of data used for the maps that drive the SPI analysis? Hundreds of rainfall sites, the quality must vary between stations.
Yes, that is absolutely true. That quality does vary between stations. So as part of our lab in the geography department here at UH Manoa, basically all of my grad school career has been doing data quality control on these stations across the state. And I think in total we had about 2,000 gauges that have operated at some point in our network. So we have done a lot of work quality controlling the data, homogenizing the data, looking for any big spikes and things. And the maps, the rainfall maps that were used in the SPI were actually created by me. And there was a lot of work that went into deciding on the interpolation method to use and quality controlling these maps as well. So we've done our best to reduce any errors due to data quality.
Okay, and we have a question from Martha. Did you look into what type of rain events were missing during drought periods? Was it the larger winter storms, or were trade showers weaker?
That's a really great question and is something that I would like to look into in the near future. A couple of other folks at the university have been looking at storm events in Hawaii and how these have been changing through time. And we've been, what they've been finding is that the atmospheric conditions in the Pacific have been less favorable for big storms that come through, like Kona low events, which are low pressure systems that just sit over the islands and dump rain. So we've been seeing fewer and fewer Kona low storms over recent years. There's also some evidence that as temperatures rise, that mid-latitude storm systems are going to move poleward. And we already kind of catch the tail end of those storms. So if they move further north from us, we will miss out on more of those storm rains. But I don't think we've been able to detect any differences in trade showers yet, but that would definitely be something to look into to better understand what's driving this.
Okay, well, thank you, Abby. It doesn't appear that we have any further questions. So I just want to say thank you again for a great presentation, and everyone that was on the line, thank you for your participation, and be on the lookout for our next webinar in this series.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Feel free to email me with any further follow-ups.